Married to a duke, she feared. She closed her eyes until his first words made her tremble with hope. Yorkshire, October 1847. The rain fell in silver threads against the carriage windows. Evelyn Hopewell's gloved fingers gripped the velvet edge of her travelling dress, her knuckles pale as bone. The carriage swayed as it crested the hill, and through the mist, the great stone facade of Ashford House emerged, imposing, ancient, and utterly devoid of welcome. She had not slept properly in 3 days. The marriage contract sat in her mind like a stone, immutable and cold. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. She pressed her free hand to her wrist, counting, a habit from childhood when her mother taught her that a steady pulse meant a steady mind, but there was nothing steady about her now. There was only the knowledge of what awaited, a man whose name was whispered in drawing rooms with something akin to dread. The Duke does not suffer weakness. The Duke demands absolute obedience. The Duke will have his way, and you shall simply endure it. The carriage lurched as it entered the long drive lined with oaks. Their bare branches clawed at the sky. Through the rain-streaked window, Evelyn caught her own reflection. Grey-green eyes wide with barely contained terror, her brown hair already coming loose from its pins, despite the careful arrangement Clara had made that morning. Clara Renfield, the housekeeper who had known Evelyn's mother's family and who had written in a letter thick with unspoken sympathy, "He is not what they say, miss. I have learned this these 5 years." But Clara's words seemed frail comfort against the weight of reputation. The carriage drew to a halt. A footman appeared, his face carefully neutral, offering his hand to help her down. The stone beneath her slippers was wet and treacherous. The grand entrance yawned before her, arched and shadowed, lit only by the grey afternoon light filtering through the rain. Inside, the house breathed around her like something living. Vast ceilings disappeared into shadow. Paintings of stern-faced men and women in earlier fashions watched from the walls. Candles flickered in wall sconces, casting moving shadows across marble floors. The air smelled of beeswax, old wood, and something else, something she could not name but which spoke of centuries of unquestioned authority. A figure descended the staircase. Even before Evelyn's mind fully registered the movement, her body knew to be still. He was exactly as described, and nothing as she had imagined. Julian Ashford, Duke of Ashford, was tall and lean, his dark coat hanging from shoulders that seemed to carry the weight of the estate itself. His hair was black, combed with meticulous precision, but it was his eyes that arrested her, a deep hazel that seemed to look through her rather than at her, and there was a scar, thin as a thread, running from his temple toward his cheekbone. In the candlelight, it seemed to suggest a history of violence or pain or both. He descended slowly. Each step was deliberate. His hand moved along the mahogany banister as if he might need its support, though his gait was utterly commanding. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he paused. For a moment, perhaps only a heartbeat's worth of time, they simply regarded one another across the marble floor. Evelyn's breath had stilled in her throat. She was acutely aware of the dampness on her hem, the disorder of her hair, the betraying rise and fall of her corset. She was aware, too, of his utter composure, the way his jaw was set, the way his eyes had become even more unreadable. "Miss Hopewell," he said. His voice was not harsh. It was, in fact, carefully measured, but it was also remote. The voice of a man speaking a formal greeting to a stranger who had appeared in his house by contractual obligation rather than by any genuine welcome. Evelyn curtsied, her knees threatening to buckle. When she rose, she could not meet his eyes. "Your Grace," she said, and was grateful that her voice did not shake. "I hope the journey was not too arduous given the weather." The question was absurd. It was his house, but she had to say something, and courtesy was the only shield she possessed. "The weather," he repeated as if the word were strange to him. "Yes, it has been relentless." Clara appeared then, seeming to materialize from the shadows with the housekeeper's gift for perfect timing. Her face was kind. That was the first genuine warmth Evelyn had felt since the carriage pulled away from her aunt's modest home. Clara curtsied with the ease of long practice. "Welcome home, Your Grace. I shall show the Duchess to her chambers. Supper is laid at 7, if that pleases you both." The Duke inclined his head in a gesture that was neither acceptance nor rejection, merely acknowledgement. But as Evelyn turned to follow Clara toward the stairs, she caught something in his expression, a brief, painful tension around the eyes, as if he were bracing against something. It came and went so quickly she could not be certain it had existed at all. As she climbed the stairs, she did not look back, but she was acutely aware of him standing below, perfectly still, watching the shadows swallow her. That night, in a room hung with burgundy damask and furnished with mahogany pieces that had witnessed centuries, Evelyn sat at the dressing table and took the pins from her hair with trembling fingers. The woman in the mirror looked like a ghost, pale, wide-eyed, utterly displaced. She pressed her fingers to her pulse again and counted to 100. The morrow would bring the formal dinner, the moment when they would sit across from one another as man and wife. The morrow would bring the beginning of whatever this marriage was to be, and she still did not know if she could survive it. The following morning broke clear and cold. Frost gathered in the corners of the window panes, creating patterns that looked almost deliberately beautiful. Evelyn dressed carefully in the pale blue morning dress that had been her mother's, altered by a modest seamstress in York. It was simple, but it did not betray desperation, or so she hoped. The breakfast room was on the eastern side of the house, and sunlight poured through tall windows that overlooked a frost-covered garden. She arrived early, thinking to collect herself and perhaps eat something before she needed to be presentable as the Duchess, but the Duke was already there. He stood at the window, a cup of tea in one hand, utterly still. He wore a waistcoat of dark green wool beneath his coat, and the colour seemed to draw out something almost human in the severity of his frame. When he heard her enter, he turned. His expression did not change, but something in his shoulders shifted, a settling, as if he had prepared for confrontation and found himself forced to find some other stance. "I hope you rested adequately," he said. It was the closest thing to gentleness she had heard from him, and it sounded almost like an apology. "Adequately, yes, thank you." She moved toward the sideboard, acutely aware of his continued attention. The coffee smelled rich and real, and she steadied herself with the familiar ritual of pouring. "The house is cold," he continued. "Clara mentioned that you might wish for additional coal in the mornings. I have instructed her to see that it is provided." Evelyn looked at him. This small attention, this consideration of her comfort, was so at odds with every story she had heard that she was momentarily without words. "You are kind to consider it, Your Grace," she managed. "I am not kind," he said flatly. "I am merely attempting to ensure that you are not uncomfortable while you adjust to your new circumstances." He paused, and she saw him reach up to turn the plain signet ring on his right hand once, twice. "The situation is not of your making. I see no reason you should suffer for it." Breakfast was eaten largely in silence, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was instead a careful silence, the kind that seemed to have weight and intention. When he was finished, he stood and bowed formally, not as a gesture of affection, but as one man might bow to another in acknowledgement of their shared position. "I have business in the estate office this morning," he said. "If you have need of anything, Clara will attend to it. This is your home now, Mrs. Ashford. You may go where you wish within it." After he left, Evelyn sat alone at the long table and felt, for the first time, that perhaps she might not die of terror in this place. Over the subsequent days and weeks, a strange pattern emerged. The Duke would encounter her in hallways and conservatories, in the library and on the stairs. Each time he would offer some small courtesy, a question about her comfort, an observation about the weather, a reference to some aspect of estate management. He never touched her, except to help her from a carriage or into a chair, and even then his hand withdrew quickly as if he feared contamination. But she began to notice things. The way he held a door open just a fraction of a second longer than etiquette required, his eyes always checking the threshold to ensure her passage was clear and unimpeded. The way he would look to the edges of rooms, as if gauging whether they could speak freely. The small unconscious gentleness of his gestures, which suggested a man carefully restraining some internal violence, not toward her but away from her, held back with rigorous discipline. One afternoon she encountered him in the library. She had been searching for a particular volume of poems, Wordsworth, thinking that something familiar might soothe her mind. Instead, she found him there, standing before a tall window with a letter in his hands. The seal was black wax, and even from across the room she could see that it had been cracked, opened, read, and then left unsealed. When he realized she was present, he quickly placed the letter among the papers on the desk. But not before she saw his hands were unsteady. "I did not mean to intrude," Evelyn said quietly. "You have not intruded." He turned to face her fully, and she noticed that the careful composure had fractured slightly. There was something raw in his expression, something that suggested the letter had contained news that troubled him deeply. "Were you searching for something?" "Merely a volume of verse, but I can return another time." "No." He moved toward the shelves with surprising purpose. "What is it you seek?" Wordsworth, if it is available. He found it without hesitation, a leather-bound copy with gilt lettering on the spine, and handed it to her. His fingers barely brushed hers, but she felt the moment of contact like electricity. "There is a passage," he said, and she heard something almost like longing in his voice, in the prelude, where he writes of a moment when fear is transformed by the understanding that one's terror was built on false perception. I have always found it curious that terror so often stems not from reality, but from the stories we tell ourselves about what is real. Evelyn held the book to her chest. "Do you believe that is always the case, Your Grace? That fear is merely misunderstanding?" He turned back to the window. In the afternoon light, the scar on his face was more visible, and she wondered, not for the first time, what violence or accident had marked him so. "I believe," he said slowly, "that some fears are well-founded, and some are the architecture of our own construction, built brick by brick from rumor and assumption. The tragedy is that they are often indistinguishable until one is brave enough to look directly at them." He did not say it, but she heard the apology beneath his words. And she understood in that moment that whatever reputation preceded him in drawing rooms and on country estates, this man was terrified of his own effect on her, that his formality was not cruelty, but a desperate attempt at protection, of her and possibly of himself. 3 weeks after her arrival, Clara found her in the morning room, where Evelyn was attempting to read by the light of the eastern window. The housekeeper's face was tight with something between concern and anger. "There is talk," Clara said without preamble, closing the door carefully behind her. "A man has come to the village, a solicitor named Crowhurst. He is spreading word that the Duke's marriage is irregular, that certain documents have been mishandled, that the union itself may not be entirely legitimate." Evelyn's stomach turned to stone. "On what basis?" "None that are honest," Clara said bitterly. "He suggests that you are not of proper standing, that the marriage was hurried to conceal something. He is insinuating, without quite saying it outright, that the Duke has compromised his name by the union, and that respectable families should question whether their daughters might refuse invitations to this house. But that is slander. Surely there is recourse against the word of a respectable solicitor, carefully chosen and carefully worded, not unless His Grace is willing to make it a public battle, and public battles damage the estate's standing regardless of their outcome." Clara sat heavily in the chair across from her. "There is something else. Crowhurst has been examining old records, estate documents. The Duke's solicitors are concerned about what he might find or fabricate." Evelyn felt the old terror return, but it was different now. It was not fear of the Duke himself, but fear for him. Fear of how this calculated campaign of whisper and insinuation might damage the reputation he had already struggled to maintain, the household he had clearly worked to rule with both authority and, she was increasingly certain, a hidden mercy. "What does His Grace say?" she asked. "Very little. That is his way, to absorb the assault without visible fracture. But I have served in this house for many years, Miss Evelyn, and I have seen his face. This one cuts deeper than the others." The formal dinner, held to introduce the Duchess to the county's respectable families, was set for the 20th of November. It was, Evelyn learned, a tradition. The Duke received perhaps 50 of the most prominent families, and the evening was a carefully choreographed display of ducal authority and social order. She spent the day in a state of gathering dread. Clara helped her dress in a gown of deep green silk, with emeralds at her throat, borrowed pieces from the ducal collections, meant to proclaim her position, even if her birth did not. But every time Evelyn caught her reflection in the mirror, she saw a woman playing at a role, not living in it. The guests began arriving as twilight fell. They came in their carriages, their women in jewels and careful smiles, their men in evening coat and starched white linen. Evelyn stood beside the Duke in the great drawing-room and felt each eye upon her like a weight. She heard the small pauses in conversation, the way questions about her family were posed with the faintest suggestion of doubt, and she saw Silas Crowhurst. He was not a tall man, but he carried himself as though he were. His face was thin-lipped and precise, his gloves impeccably white. He moved through the room with the confidence of a man who believed he held leverage, and when he encountered the Duke, his smile had the quality of something predatory. "Your Grace," Crowhurst said, his voice pitched for near privacy, though loud enough that Evelyn, standing just behind her husband, could hear clearly. "I have been reviewing certain of the estate's historical documents. Fascinating material. Perhaps we might speak after dinner. There are some matters that require clarification." The Duke's jaw tightened imperceptibly. I shall review any materials brought to my attention through the proper channels, Crowhurst. I am not in the habit of conducting business at social occasions. Of course. Though one might argue that matters affecting the legitimacy of the ducal claim could scarcely be delayed. Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. Around them, conversations paused. Eyes turned their direction. She saw in the Duke's face the exact moment he recognized that Crowhurst had just made an accusation in public, shrouded in the language of courtesy, but devastating in its implications. The Duke did not answer. Instead, he placed a hand, subtle as air, but unmistakable, on the small of Evelyn's back. It was a gesture of absolute claim, of unqualified alliance, and then he guided her toward the dining room with a composure so perfect it seemed to rebuke everyone who witnessed it. Dinner was torture. Courses came and went. Wine was poured and sipped. Conversation continued, but it had changed, become fractured, uncertain. Evelyn watched the Duke, who ate precisely, drank sparingly, and maintained a dignity so absolute that it seemed to ring through the room like a bell. It was only when the women withdrew and the men were left to their port and cigars that Clara found her in the small sitting room where the ladies had gathered. The housekeeper bent close, her voice barely above a whisper. "The letter," she said, "the one with the black seal. It came 3 days ago. I saw it in his study. I should not tell you this, but you need to know. It bears the mark of a London solicitor, and it arrived just after Crowhurst came to the village." "What does it contain?" Evelyn asked, though she knew Clara could not possibly know. "I do not know, but His Grace has opened and resealed it, and he has not left the study since. That is not the behavior of a man who is not deeply troubled." The women returned to the drawing room. The men rejoined them an hour later, and there, before all the assembled county, something extraordinary happened. The Duke walked directly to where Evelyn stood, speaking in low tones with the wife of the vicar, and he took her hand. His grip was firm, warm, and entirely without apology. "I find myself wishing to speak with my wife," he said, "to no one and to everyone. If you will excuse us." He led her from the drawing-room, through the corridor, and into the library. The room was lit only by the fire, which cast everything in shades of gold and shadow. When he closed the door, the sound seemed to seal off the rest of the world. Evelyn's heart was racing. "Your Grace, what has happened? What does Crowhurst mean to—" "He means to suggest," the Duke interrupted, "that our marriage is invalid because I acted without proper consultation of certain trustees. He has discovered, or believes he has discovered, evidence that I was not granted full authority to take a bride without approval from the entail holders." He paused, and she saw his hands were slightly unsteady. "It is a tenuous argument, but it is the sort of argument that, repeated in the right quarters, becomes a reputation rather than a mere legal question. But surely the letter," he continued, moving toward the desk, "arrived from the principal trustee 3 days ago. I have been attempting to determine how best to manage the situation without drawing further suspicion." He opened the drawer and withdrew the letter with the black seal, and then he held it out to her. "Read it," he said. With trembling fingers, Evelyn broke the seal and unfolded the paper. What she read made her eyes fill with tears. "The union is valid beyond question. Moreover, I give you my full blessing, which carries weight among the other trustees. Crowhurst has been in my employ briefly, and I removed him because I discovered he was systematically misrepresenting documents for purposes of blackmail. I do not yet know his intention toward you, but you should know that his credibility is not what he wishes the world to believe. You have my absolute faith in your choice of a wife." The letter was signed by the principal trustee, the Earl of something unpronounceable, dated only 5 days past. When she looked up from the paper, tears were streaming freely down her face. "You knew," she whispered. "You have known since this letter arrived that Crowhurst's accusations have no foundation, yet you allowed tonight to unfold as it did, allowing him to make his implications public, allowing people to question." "I allowed it," the Duke said quietly, "because a private letter means nothing against a public accusation, but a public statement from me, made in the presence of witnesses, declaring my absolute conviction that our marriage is valid, and that any suggestion otherwise is a malicious falsehood. That will be remembered." He moved closer to her, and for the first time, she saw the terrible cost of his composure written across his face. "Evelyn," he said, and his voice broke slightly on her name, "I need you to understand something. From the moment you arrived in this house, I have been terrified that I would damage you simply by the fact of my existence, that people's fear of me would somehow become your burden, That has been my only fear. Not Crowhurst's accusations, not the legal technicalities, but the possibility that you would begin to believe the stories that have been told about me, that you would come to see me as the threat everyone insists that I am. He took another step closer, and now she could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the desperate hope that seemed to war with despair. But tonight, he continued, I realized that what people fear in me is not my cruelty, but my strength. And I would use every measure of that strength, the strength they fear, the strength they think makes me dangerous, to protect you, to stand beside you, to make certain that every person in this county understands that if they seek to diminish you, they are diminishing me, and that is not a thing I will permit. He raised his hand, and with infinite gentleness, touched his fingers to her cheek. I am not the man they say I am, Evelyn. I hope that perhaps you have begun to see that, but more than that, I wish to be the man you need me to be. I wish to be the man capable of loving you with the whole force of his being, and doing so without apology or fear. When he kissed her, it was not with the passionate violence she had somehow expected a duke to employ. It was instead like the final, tender note of a piece of music that had been building toward resolution, a touch that said, yes, here, at last, is the truth beneath everything else. The aftermath of that evening was peculiar in its peacefulness. Crowhurst, realizing that his accusations had been met with both aristocratic steadiness and demonstrable proof of their falsity, withdrew from the village within a week. The solicitor who had employed him made inquiries, discovered the pattern of misrepresentation and blackmail, and had him brought before the magistrate on charges related to the forgery of documents. It was all conducted with remarkable efficiency and, more importantly, with remarkable discretion. By the time the county fully understood what had occurred, the story had transformed from one of scandal to one of swift, decisive justice, meted out by a duke who would not tolerate dishonesty. And something had shifted in how people spoke of Julian Ashford. He was still feared. That, Evelyn began to understand, was perhaps inevitable for a man of his station and temperament. But the fear had transformed into something more complicated. Respect, tinged with the grudging acknowledgement that here was a man of genuine principle, not merely of position. But these external transformations were insignificant compared to what had changed within the house itself. It was the first week of December when Evelyn found herself once more in the library. She had begun to treat it as a kind of sanctuary, a place where the weight of the household's formality seemed to lighten slightly, where the great windows opened onto a landscape of frost and bare trees that seemed to understand something of solitude. The Duke found her there, as he seemed increasingly to do, and he no longer pretended surprise at her presence. Instead, he simply asked if he might sit beside her. The book she had been reading, the Wordsworth he had given her, lay open on her lap. He picked it up and read the passage she had been absorbed in, that blessed mood in which the burden of the mystery, in which the heavy and the weary weight of all this unintelligible world is lightened. "Did you find it?" he asked. "The passage where fear is transformed?" "I did." She looked at him, and for the first time, she allowed her eyes to meet his without reservation. He writes of a moment when the self seems to dissolve entirely into the landscape, and in that dissolution, fear cannot exist, because there is no self to be afraid. Precisely. The Duke turned slightly so that he was fully facing her. "I have spent a great deal of time attempting to construct an impenetrable self, a figure so controlled and so strong that nothing could penetrate it. I believed that was what a duke must be, what a man must be, if he was to be worthy of anything." He paused, and she saw him summon courage, as if it were an object he kept in reserve. "But then you came to this house," he continued, "and I began to understand that strength and tenderness are not opposing forces, that a man can be powerful and still be gentle, that one can protect and still be vulnerable, at least to one person in one room, beneath one lamp." He reached for her hand, and this time he did not withdraw it quickly. Instead, he brought it to his chest over his heart, and she felt the fierce, steady rhythm of his pulse against her palm. "I love you," he said simply. "I have loved you since the morning you sat at the breakfast table and managed to maintain composure whilst terrified. I love you because you are brave, not because you are fearless, but because you are courageous despite your fear. And if you can find it in yourself to accept that love, to trust that it is genuine and constant and will endure, then I believe I may finally become the man I have always wished to be." Evelyn felt her eyes burn with tears, not of fear this time, but of a profound relief, as if a door she had not known was locked had suddenly swung open. "I do trust it," she whispered. "I have been coming to trust it for weeks, though I was too afraid to acknowledge it. Your Grace, Julian, I do love you, not despite what they say you are, but because of who you actually are." He kissed her then, there in the library, with the Wordsworth falling forgotten to the floor, with the winter light streaming through the tall windows, with the weight of centuries of history surrounding them. And for the first time, it seemed to Evelyn that the house itself seemed to breathe with something like happiness. 6 years later, a sitting room in Ashford House, decorated for Christmas. Snow falls beyond the windows, and a child of perhaps 2 years old sits by the fire, building a precarious tower of wooden blocks. The Duchess, her hair still that familiar brown with now the faintest thread of silver catching the lamplight, sits beside the child, ready to catch the inevitable tumble. When the tower falls, the child laughs with pure delight, and the sound fills the room like music. The Duke enters, carrying a letter sealed with black wax, though this time it remains sealed. He places it gently on the table beside his wife and kisses the top of her head, then bends to lift the child, who squeals with joy and throws small arms around his neck. But now, dear listener, I must speak to you directly, as one heart to another, across the space that divides the story from your ear. Perhaps you too have stood as Evelyn stood, afraid of a threshold you were forced to cross. Perhaps you have known the terror of circumstances beyond your control, the belief that the worst version of a person is the truest version, the conviction that mercy and tenderness are things meant for others, not for you. This story was written for you, if that is where you stand, because I want you to know something that Evelyn took 6 weeks to learn, but which might take you far longer. The person you fear most, the circumstance that seems most hostile, the future that appears most bleak, these things are often exactly what they seem, but sometimes, only sometimes, they contain within them the possibility of transformation, not because the thing itself changes, but because you change, because you gather courage, not because you lack fear, but despite it, because you look directly at what terrifies you and discover that beneath the stern exterior, the careful formality, the weight of reputation, there is often a heart that has been waiting, with infinite patience, for permission to reveal itself. You are not too old. You are not too broken. You are not too unworthy of gentleness, of protection, of love that asks for nothing except that you accept it. The person you fear, the future you dread, may yet surprise you, may yet become the source of your greatest healing. And if that does not happen, if the world continues to be difficult, if people continue to be cruel, if circumstances remain hard, I want you to know that you are still worthy, that your courage, even in the face of that hardship, is enough, that closing your eyes in fear is human, but opening them again, again, and again is where your true nobility lies. This is not a promise that everything will resolve as it does in Evelyn's story, but it is a reminder that sometimes, in the quiet library of our own lives, we discover that the person or the moment we feared most was actually waiting to teach us something essential, that we are stronger than we knew, braver than we believed, and far more worthy of love than we dared to imagine. Now, if this tale has touched your heart, I ask you this. Will you tell us in the comments whether you too have known fear transformed into hope? Have you encountered a moment when someone's first true words changed everything you believed about them? And will you not subscribe to our channel so that we may bring you more stories of redemption, of second chances, of the gentle strength that lies hidden beneath a stern facade? There are many such tales yet untold, stories of widows and dukes, of governesses and earls, of the quiet revolutions that happen in drawing rooms and libraries when people find the courage to see one another truly. We thank you for the time you have devoted to Evelyn and Julian's story. May you find, in the quietness of your own evening, the same tenderness they discovered. From all of us at Victorian Love Stories, with gratitude and warmth. Throughout history, the greatest injustices have been committed not by those who openly declare their cruelty, but by those who allow reputation to stand in the place of truth. We build monuments of fear around people, sometimes strangers, sometimes those closest to us, and then mistake the monument for the person. We decide that a stern face means a cruel heart, that formality means indifference, that power must necessarily be wielded without compassion. And in doing so, we rob ourselves and them of the possibility of genuine connection. Evelyn Hopewell's journey was not primarily about romantic love, though romance was present in it. It was about learning to distinguish between the stories we tell ourselves and the reality that exists beneath those stories. It was about recognizing that fear is not always a reliable guide to truth. And it was about understanding that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to stand still long enough to let someone prove that your terror was constructed from false premises. This applies to far more than romantic relationships. In our lives, we encounter people who intimidate us, perhaps because of their position, their reputation, or the circumstances of our relationship with them. We construct narratives about who they are and what they intend. We assume the worst. And in doing so, we often prevent ourselves from experiencing the genuine humanity that might exist beneath the surface. The Duke in this story was feared because of his silence and his strength, but that very silence and strength were what allowed him to be truly gentle when gentleness was required. He was not cruel, he was careful, he was not indifferent. He was protecting himself because he feared his own power. And the moment someone was willing to look past the reputation and see the man beneath it, everything changed. We encourage you to ask yourself, where have I built walls of assumption around someone? Where have I allowed fear to prevent me from seeing clearly? Is there someone in my life, a parent, a friend, a stranger, whom I have judged based on reputation rather than on actual evidence of their character? And perhaps more importantly, am I the person that others fear without cause? Am I so careful to protect myself that I have become, in the eyes of others, a stone wall instead of a human being? The work of creating genuine connection, whether romantic or otherwise, requires that we first dismantle the monuments of fear and assumption that stand between us and others. It requires that we be willing to be seen and to see others with clarity and compassion. If this story has resonated with you, we ask that you do 3 things. First, subscribe to our channel so that you may receive more stories of transformation, redemption, and the gentle strength that often lies hidden beneath a stern or frightened surface. Second, share your own story in the comments. Tell us of a time when someone surprised you by being kinder than you expected. Tell us of a moment when a feared person became beloved. Tell us how you learned to see past reputation to character. Your stories strengthen our community and remind others that they too are not alone in their journey from fear to hope. Third, if there is someone in your life whose reputation you have judged without truly knowing them, consider offering them the same grace that Evelyn offered Julian. Consider asking them directly about their intentions, their hopes, their fears. You may find that beneath the stern facade is a heart that has been waiting for permission to show itself. We are grateful, truly grateful, for the time you have spent with us this evening, that you have chosen to listen to the story of a woman learning to trust, a man learning to reveal his heart, and a household learning to embrace both strength and tenderness. Your presence, your attention, your willingness to enter into these stories with openness and faith, these are what make our work possible. Until our next tale, we wish you the courage to see clearly, the wisdom to look past reputation to truth, and the grace to be surprised by kindness, both in others and in yourself. With warmth and profound gratitude, Victorian Love Stories.